collective, and it's a mission-driven entity operating in parallel to Aeon's strategy. The aim of the collective is really to advance cooperation and efforts towards sustainability and development through communications, addressing knowledge gaps, enhancing dialogue, particularly those at the intersection of energy and environment, and of course socioeconomic well-being, by encouraging and mobilizing collaborations across disciplines, and by tapping into the intersection of the sciences and humanities. SST is the result of a joint effort between the Aeon team and a handful of sustainability experts from leading organizations in the kingdom, all of whom are in this room with us this evening. The aim really is to harness sustainability efforts in the kingdom, learn from both international, regional, and local experiences and expertise, build on existing efforts, and generate constructive dialogue around sustainability practices to enhance awareness, build capacities, and increase impact. Today's topic will be focusing on sustainability, communicating sustainability, specifically on climate, the intersection of climate and energy. So over the last decade, about 22 million people have migrated or been displaced due to climate stresses and natural disasters. The Middle East is known to be one of the most vulnerable regions to water scarcity, extreme heat, and desertification. In light of that, global population is projected to increase to over 9 billion by 2050, and our energy uses seem to increase by at least 1/4, with subsequent emissions on the rise. Fossil fuels are seen to continue playing a dominant role, even in the most optimistic scenarios, specifically in areas that are difficult to decarbonize, while the share of renewables in the global energy mix continues to grow, albeit from a lower starting point. However, various solutions are known to lessen the negative impact of climate change, as we all know, on societies, with adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency holding equal importance for ensuring a sustainable future. The energy industry has made great strides in energy efficiency, alternative and cleaner fuels, and technological advancements, including carbon capture technologies and utilization, offer promising solutions. A lot, however, remains to be done in R&D to achieve our clean energy goals. Changes in business models, policy decisions, and financial opportunities play an equally large role. While the science on climate change is clear and indisputable, climate impact uncertainties, various climate patterns across the region, known unknowns and unknown unknowns, also add to the complexity of this topic, and the difficulties reporting on it, of course. So in turn, creating dissonance and confusion among the masses. Sound, balanced, and unbiased reporting is challenging and requires at least a basic understanding of the sciences as well as the political and economic landscape surrounding it. It is therefore imperative that communication is strengthened on this front, shifting the polarizing narrative to one that is objective, engaging, and inclusive. Following our leadership's ambitious plan on Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan, Saudi Arabia is poised to be at the forefront of the global effort to addressing our sustainable challenges and our goals. Our hope is through gatherings like these, and with people like you, that we are able to inspire, mobilize, and advance collective efforts towards achieving our goals. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening, Dr. Nicholas Howarth, Senior Research Colorist at CAPSARC. Dr. Nicholas is an economist specializing in natural resource and the environment. His current focus is on sustainable development and green growth pathways in the kingdom. Nicholas?
Thank you very much. And good evening, everybody, from me. And welcome to this evening's discussion with Andrew Revkin on the topic of effective communication pathways for sustainability. Tonight's session will be broken into two parts. Part one is a live stream, which will take about 1 hour, and will be led by our guest speaker, Andrew Revkin, who will introduce the topic, followed by questions from both within the room, but I'd particularly like to encourage participants who are online. Last month's sustainability talk, we had around 200 participants online. So please don't be shy if you're not in the room in putting forward your questions. They're being collected and we'll do our best to get to them. Part 2 of the evening will be see the end of the live stream, and it will be a closed discussion held under Chatham House rules. In the spirit of open and informal discussion that we want to promote here, we request that while participants are free to use the insights from what we discuss here tonight, that they do not report on this part of the discussion or mention who said what or who was here. But obviously the first part of the evening is going to be streamed live and will be available after the event online. So that part...
Oh, no, I see you. Yeah, okay.
Is on the record. Welcome. Welcome, Andrew. I can think of few other better people who can better speak to the importance of cultivating awareness of environmental issues than our guest speaker tonight. Andrew Rifkin is one of America's most respected writers on environmental sustainability, author of many books and a long-time reporter for the New York Times and founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Many of you may know him as the first to identify the concept of the Anthropocene, a new, now commonly used term to describe our current geological epoch with humankind's impact on the planet at its core. With Saudi Arabia now opening up new opportunities in the sustainability space as part of its Vision 2030 program, and with the spotlight shifting to the country as host of the G20 next year, we are looking forward to hearing what Andrew has to say about the opportunities for a new conversation in the kingdom around sustainability, which can face up to the environmental challenges we have in a world where communications often create confusion and polarization as much as it educates and inspires. So with that, Andrew, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you perfectly.
Great. I'm sorry I had a little technical issue there at the last minute. It's great to be with you virtually. I'd like to meet you all directly sometime. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm really glad that Aeon Strategies has this interest in connectivity and focusing on the communication aspect of how we make progress and share insights on a very fast forward planet where there's actually too much information, it often seems. And that I wouldn't say that's worse than no information, but sometimes it feels that way. The journey I've been on started 35 years ago. I'll just show you what we used to do as journalists, and then I'll explain a little more about why I'm broadening my focus from journalism to communication impact more generally. Back in the day, this is my 1988. My first big article on global warming was in 1988 in Discover magazine. And it was a long, thorough report. That was the year Jim Hansen was had testified in the Senate in the United States that global warming, to his calculation, was already perceptible in the data on climate change. And so there's Endless Summer, Living with the Greenhouse Effect, 6,000 words, intensifying droughts, ice sheets, especially in Antarctica at the time. The prediction was for substantial sea level rise. Storms, we had a section on hurricanes getting more intense because sea temperatures would be rising. And it felt at that point in the 1980s, from then forward for the first 10 years of my coverage, I think it felt like a conventional pollution story, that this is something we have dealt with already through the Clean Air Act and international efforts to clean up conventional pollution. So why not? What's different about carbon dioxide? It's a greenhouse gas. It comes out of tailpipes and smokestacks, and we just need to have a treaty or a law. And a lot of the reporting, including the reporting I did at that time, had that focus. There was the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. We had successfully had an agreement to curtail chlorofluorocarbons, the refrigerants and other compounds that were identified as a threat to the ozone layer. And the model for the diplomacy around climate was similar. But that's when the broader dimensions of the climate problem became more and more evident to me as a reporter, and I think to the world as it became clear that each year's negotiations toward a treaty with timetables and targets limiting carbon dioxide seem far harder to achieve than one for something like CFCs. The big message there, if you look carefully, and even back in that article, there was a section where a European diplomat warned me, and I quoted him as saying, "Well, you can get the heads of the companies that make chlorofluorocarbons into one room. There are about 38 at that time, and you can't do that with carbon dioxide. It's basically a fundamental emission related to progress. If you look at energy access, mobility, heating and cooling, manufacturing, all the things that abundant energy and fuels allow us to do, then you realize it's not the same thing." So that storyline was kind of, that made it a more complicated story to tell. And for conventional environmental messaging, it made it a very frustrating situation. By around 2006, well, I joined the New York Times in the 90s. And by the mid-2000s, it was getting clear that this is a tougher story in another way, that it had become very polarized. The United States was kind of the focal point for some of the polarization, but it exists elsewhere as well. And that, I began writing about that aspect of the article, and it was clear not only that, as I said earlier, energy abundance being a proxy for prosperity made it hard to limit climate change. And the mid-2000s, it was clearer that we have these pretty interesting human characteristics that make it hard for us to avoid getting into sort of a tribal structure around an issue like this, where our tendency to adhere to our culture, if you're a conservative, that meant it's abortion and gun rights in the United States, and climate change was becoming more like an emblem like that, which makes it even harder to figure out how to forge progress, because there's a body of science actually that's emerged. There's a scholar at Yale at the law school named Dan Kahane, Kahan, who's done a body of research that he calls cultural cognition, that when something becomes polarized, your tendency to adhere to your tribe, political party, your base, the people who you identify with, way outweighs your adherence to facts. And this can be at either end of the spectrum. It's not just conservatives. If you're liberal and progressive, you tend to, there's been studies showing that, well, you think of something like nuclear power, for example, shows you that people who are very worried about global warming can have fundamentally different views of whether nuclear power should be part of the solution. And much of that is not based on data. It's based on your tribe's perception of these two kinds of issues. So that was another element that made it a harder story to tell and to consider. And there's one more, I think, that's worth getting into, which is that there's been more confusion lately about between what is driving the losses in extreme events in the weather system or coastal loss, in recent decades so far is mostly not from a change in the climate. It's from a change in how many people are exposed to the problem or their vulnerability. In other words, and I began reporting on aspects of this where Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines around 2014, it hit the city of Tacloban, and it was devastating. There were several thousand deaths from the storm surge. But what was missed there, a lot of the rhetoric around that storm at the time was focused on global warming. There was another UN summit coming up. The Pope passed through there and was messaging about climate change. But what had really boosted the losses from that storm was more the fact that the population of that city had quadrupled, 4 times increase in population in 40 or so years. And many of the people who had moved into this city of Tacloban were poor or recent migrants, so they lived in marginal areas like floodplains. And that means that, to me as a journalist, it became more important to focus on being careful about not overinterpreting something as climate change when climate vulnerability. On Twitter, I've been using the vulnerability crisis as a hashtag to remind people that there are other things in motion right now. And that's all the parameters of the story of climate change. And then, of course, what's happened in my career is this unbelievable change in the communication environment. That there used to be authorities, people, science writers like me and magazines like that would write a story. In the New York Times, you'd read the front page. American broadcasters or the BBC, you'd listen to the news, and the news audience didn't have to really think too much. We have our famous 20th century newscaster in the United States, Walter Cronkite, who used to end his broadcast every night by saying, "That's the way it is." And that was very simple and reassuring. We all sort of watched the same 3 networks and had a common view of the world. And now with the information environment we have that's exploded just in the last 10 or 15 years, it's fundamentally transformed the way we learn what the world's doing in any particular day. It's fundamentally changed the nature of community. Your community really used to be the people around you. And now, depending on your orientation or your cultural affiliation or your passions, your community can be anywhere in the world, but very concentrated, very aggregated in a way like never before because of social connectedness. Finding fact from fiction is harder than ever because it's all flowing by in this torrent of digital content that, again, we tend to, because of behavioral science shows quite clearly, we're very attracted in the moment to things that validate us. That's why Facebook has that little like button. Or things that aggravate us or make us angry. And there are people who write the algorithm, the software, the programming that's done to keep you on Facebook or on Twitter or heaven forbid on Snapchat. It's all designed to keep you, hold you, and either validate you or anger you moment by moment. And that can lead you down to the sort of the lower common denominator of human experience. And there's, even within the community creating this online environment, people at Facebook and Google, there's a subculture that's emerged just working on, well, how can we, what's the ethical responsibility there to make the system work a little bit more toward elevating us and connecting us around constructive, solution-oriented pathways, as opposed to just debating things. And this is one of the grand challenges of our time, I think. And I made a decision a few years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, actually 9 years ago, when I first moved to Pace University for 6 years to teach along with my writing, I decided to focus more and more of my attention on the bigger question of how do you make reality matter? How do you make information matter in a world with too much information and all of this confusion and change? And at Columbia University now, I convinced folks there a few months ago that there's a gap in the universe. There's a gap in universities. There are journalism programs, including a great one here at Columbia. There are communication departments that mostly do scholarship about social media and the like, and that's really important. But my idea here is to make a hub for testing and facilitating access to ways to make progress on the ground on issues that matter right now in the context of climate and sustainability. And these are, sometimes it's about journalism training. Sometimes it's about building an interface or practices through which scientists and journalists can communicate more effectively. Sometimes it's about working with corporations to see how they can actualize this concept of corporate social responsibility or environmental responsibility in the context of understanding that one of the upsides of the information environment we're in now is that it's possible ever more to impose transparency on a company, to impose to reveal the supply chains through which the products that come together to make a manufactured product, whether it's an iPhone or whatever, that there's ways to trace that chain all the way back to the raw ingredients, the lithium and the like. We can do that. There's and this is not just companies, it's countries. China now, I haven't seen anyone prove this, but China has tended to be more forthright about its use of coal in recent years, and there's thinking that some of that is due to the fact that now with remote sensing, with satellites, it's possible to from the outside to track very precisely which coal burning power plants in China are operating, which ones aren't operating, how much coal they're using. Back at 40, 50 years ago during the Cold War, satellite monitoring and the like was the domain of intelligence agencies, and now it's the domain of companies like Digital Globe, and that means that high-resolution photography, almost in real time, can give the whole world a more accurate picture of what is happening with deforestation in the Amazon, what's happening with, as I said, coal use. There's a website now called Global Fishing Watch, which is able to take data from ship movements and track more precisely if fleets of vessels are operating in waters they should not be operating in, to get fishing in preserves that or the like. So that's the upside. It's kind of an exciting moment. And as I said, as I like to point out too, the other thing, just to give you another example of how the tools we have now can foster more effective communication in ways that don't involve journalism. In India, where there are 100 million families farming, that's a 500 million people. It's hard to think of how the government or anyone else could spread better information on how to do agriculture effectively in a changing climate, or in a region prone to drought, or if your water is becoming salty because of saltwater intrusion. And now there is a network of Digital Green is a nonprofit group there that's doing a little bit of capacity building on how to shoot videos so farmers can explain to each other using YouTube as a platform in a dozen different languages They can share information on better farming practices or a new seed variety and the like. And not every farmer has Wi-Fi, but every farming community has an internet cafe and the like. So that's another example of how the kind of thing that we'll be trying to work to assess here and to propagate where it makes sense. So that's kind of the transition I've been on. This is brand new. We already have some projects up and running. They're just getting going. There's an international journalism capacity building organization called Global Press, the Global Press Center. And they're training journalists, female journalists around the world in developing countries, just in general reporting capacity. And they have a website and a news service. And we just have a small grant to get started testing, working with them to integrate Columbia's expertise in climate science with their reporting so that we can have stories that are more effective on the ground in places with the most environmental risk in a changing climate, with reporters who can then integrate scientific expertise and data from Columbia's Earth Institute and from other experts as well. We are doing a similar project with a collaboration with journalists here in the northeastern United States, working on new ways to convey to communities the risks along coastlines with rising sea levels. And there's more getting underway. We'll be teaching new courses, helping to build a network, a digital network and face-to-face network, including people like the team at Aon, who at least two of whom came from Columbia University, to make sure our alumni network and the global centers that Columbia has in 10 different places, including Amman, Jordan, can serve as a way to amplify and spread the better practices using social media and, again, the journalism toolkit that might be more effective than what we have right now. So that's an initial sketch of the journey from old style journalism to seeking more effective overall impact from communication. And I hope that the connection's been good. I'm happy to talk further. We can get into some questions.
I loved how you summarize part of your mission is how do we make reality matter in the public discourse that we're all involved in with sustainability. And I think our channels are now open online to receive questions from outside. But while those are being collected, I might just open it first for a first question to the room. If anybody had a comment or a reaction to Andrew's opening remarks. So I certainly had some, people are probably a bit shy with the first question, so as a moderator, I'll jump in. Andrew, there's been a lot of talk about this post-truth world, where feelings seem to carry as much weight as the facts behind an issue. And we see that in a whole range of currently very polarized discussions. And as being part British, you can't avoid that juggernaut of Brexit, which has evolved in exactly the way that you outlined, where these tribal groups have now moved into their corners in such a way that it's almost impossible to even have a conversation within your family about an issue where views might be different, in that facts have been taken off the table. So how do we, in the environmental debate, where climate change is often, it's very tempting to say, well, these guys are the fossil fuel lobby and these guys are the greenies, and the two shall never meet because of this risk of polarization. And coming from Saudi Arabia, of course, where the great progress has been made, built on fossil fuel wealth, how do we move perhaps beyond the risk of polarization, maybe stopping this, I think, new wave of sustainability that we're seeing come through in the kingdom as part of Vision 2030? And do you have any advice for us here on what might be a pathway forward in this region based on what you've seen?
Yeah, well, boy, as you've articulated, the challenges are really profound. To me, one valuable way to start is to divide this thing called the climate crisis into its component parts. And I think what I've seen too often is that the fights intensify around that phrase, whether you call it a climate crisis, climate emergency, global warming, doesn't matter. But the problem when these disputes come out around that are more generalized like that is they miss the opportunities that exist when you do subdivide it. And I'll just give you an example. As I mentioned earlier, there's deep awareness that the world is not equal in its exposure to the hazards related to climate change or to just the existing climate variability. The sub-Saharan Africa, the countries on the African continent just south of the Sahara, live in a zone that this field called paleoclimatology, meaning studying past climates by looking at the sediment and all kinds of proxies for climate conditions going back in time. You look at that record and it says that that area of the world is incredibly vulnerable to drought. I wrote a story for the New York Times in 2009 about a pivotal paper out of Ghana where there's a lake that has an unbelievably detailed record of climate. And it shows very clearly that droughts that last a century or more are common, not common, but are in the system, that they're probably related to Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean variability and all kinds of factors. So you know that drought is a profound threat there. You know that those countries also are among the poorest and most vulnerable countries to any climate hazard now. High fertility rates, limited governance, limited education for women. And so you can identify very quickly some important things to work on there that are not the climate crisis. They're about vulnerability, they're about governance, they're about roads that function so farmers can get goods to market. And then on energy, the same thing. There are people in this world who I've been in their homes where they're cooking on firewood or dung, and the levels of pollution are unbelievable. How many hours in a woman's life are devoted to collecting fuel, cooking, cleaning the pots from the smoke, plus having your life shortened by the pollution. It's an extraordinary problem. And millions of people are dying prematurely right now because of that pollution. So that gives you something to work on. And by the way, inconveniently for some, one of the solutions there is LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which is a byproduct of gas and oil production in many parts of the world. So LPG can address household pollution, gives an off-on, highly efficient form of cooking energy right now. So there's two frontiers you can work on aggressively to improve people's prospects. The most vulnerable people in the world to both climate hazards and to the lack of energy can be, you can work on that stuff and not get into big fights. Although there are some still, there's some out there who want to stop LPG because it's a fossil fuel. So I think that creates a communication opportunity. And then climate on energy transitions. It is clear that in the end, fossil fuels are finite, that even there's obviously many of the folks in the Gulf region and in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and elsewhere recognize that that several things need work. One is an economic transition eventually away from oil and gas. Gas will take longer. And another would be decarbonization. What are the pathways to capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere? Columbia University has a very significant initiative on some of the technical and scientific questions related to doing that at a scale that would matter to the climate system. Many other places. So if it would seem logical that in regions that still have a abundant oil and gas resource would have a great interest in investing in ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. It's a tough challenge on every scale. But that's clearly part of what climate science has identified as you can't just slow down emissions by changing energy sources. We have to figure out how to capture some CO2 as well. And in that sense, so what I'm saying is that there's a menu of pathways forward. And one, by the way, the other one is, and you don't hear a lot about it because it's inconvenient, is we don't know how to do this. There's a lot of science that needs to be done, both on advancing battery technology, on, as I said, deep decarbonization pathways. There's still things we don't know how to do. And I wrote a lot about the deep research deficit, I guess you could call it. The world there was a significant pulse of energy science in the 1970s. Actually, it was when OPEC had threatened to curtail global supplies. The United States did a pulse of basic R&D investment. Europe, to some extent, that was when France pushed over to nuclear power significantly. But since that time, there's been no real increase in basic science on energy frontiers. And that seems to be, it's something I've written about a lot. There's few people in the world who think more science is a bad idea in that sense. And when you look at the amount of money that is spent globally, the OECD countries, the United States, on the basic sciences related to having truly sustainable energy sources going forward, it's tiny. So I just say break it into pieces and you can have more realistic conversations.
That answer, I think, I took away that making the sustainability relate to local issues rather than that impact people's lives, rather than indulging in debates about grand ideas is one pathway forward to make it tangible. Also wait for Saudi Arabia, which hopefully we'll pick up on, how to take carbon out of the atmosphere and be proactive in that as part of the process of, in some ways, prolonging the stewardship of your carbon resources, recognizing that social responsibility to the broader global community, as well as ensuring sustainable economy. So I know there's a few questions that have come in.
Yeah, so I actually just wanted to follow up on that and ask, in light of the US pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, how do you think that's changed the discussion of climate change around the world and regulations associated from government?
Yeah. Well, one thing, we're not out yet. There's a delay in how a country withdraws, and it's conceivable, depending on the next election, that we won't be out completely. It certainly has not helped to have such a major economy reverse course like that. The treaty was hard enough the agreement was hard enough to reach, that its provisions are nearly all of the provisions are voluntary and or aspirational. The only terms that are binding are about the structure of the conversation going forward in time, not about the old model with targets and timetables. So it's regrettable that the current administration, basically to satisfy a pledge that was made during the campaign, the Trump campaign, has done this. It doesn't mean that the treaty is dead. The agreement, it has probably slowed down other countries' commitments. But one thing I did learn also, in having reported on this since the 80s, since before even the Framework Convention, is that we can't expect necessarily that the treaty process, this top-down process, is going to be determinative. The one thing I found in writing, I wrote a long piece the day the Paris Agreement was reached for the Times, where I tried to describe the this really uncomfortable reality that the Paris Agreement is essentially the perfect architecture for a 21st century path toward a new relationship between people and the climate and energy. But it's also perfectly insufficient. So it's perfect in terms of diplomacy because the only way to get nearly 200 countries to agree on anything is to have flexible terms, nationally determined NDC. But the science says we have to go towards zero emissions by mid to late century. And there's no way the Paris Agreement will do that. So what do you work on? Well, you work on enabling, you work on lowering the threshold of political pain. And the one way to do that is, again, through advancing technologies or science so that the cost of the transition can be lower. The history of this was mostly the other way. Well, we need a tax, or you need a negative pressure to get us moving in the right direction. Just in 30 years of reporting on this, I don't see much evidence we're going to have a carbon price that's meaningful, particularly one that would affect the regions of the world where the emissions growth is greatest. There's no, India has every right to claim what they call the carbon space that's left in the budget, the global budget, because so few, you have over 1 billion people, and 500 million of them don't have reliable electricity, and 300 million don't have any electricity. And coal is there, and they're doing a lot with solar, et cetera, but it's hard to see how you constrain their mandate to develop. So it's a tough situation. I do think in the U.S., what happened these last few years in more than one way has slowed things down, but I don't think the inverse is true, that if we had stayed in, that somehow we would be on some magically steeper path toward progress. It's an uncomfortable situation to write on something where, to be honest to the data, you have to say, well, we're not going to get this remotely right. You don't get a page 1 headline out of that. It's a complex journey. And I do think there's plenty to work on within the way the treaty is, the agreement is framed, to stimulate some surprises on the upside, some better outcomes. I do think more of a focus on R&D, large-scale demonstration of technologies that would be needed to speed the path is essential. And that's still not even really fully integrated into the agreement. So that would be something to think about going forward.
Andrew, for that reaction. No?
Hi. My name is Natasha. I'm with the King Khalid Foundation. I wanted to ask a question about, I feel like we're still at the point of people denying climate change or, saying that it exists. The science is there, so why are we even at the point where discussion is focusing on that? If the science is fully there, why aren't we focusing more on trying to find solutions rather than still fighting? So the facts are there or they're not there. So I feel like we're 2 steps back from where we should be, and then people are talking, the scientists are saying, well, the house is burning, and the people who are denying it are saying, well, there's not even a house there. So, so how do we react to that? If the house is burning, you know what you're gonna do. You're not gonna necessarily get a new stove. You're gonna take water and try to, So I feel like we're completely discombobulated with this whole, what are the facts really, and why are we not agreeing with the facts and using this for some political games or whatever it is? So how do you, in terms of communication, how do you direct this in the right direction rather than still discussing things that are not even way backwards, especially in the rest of the world, it's
Sure.
as well. Thank you.
I know it's one of the grand challenges still. I think what you see often is a function of a couple of things. That the global warming, this background push on the system from the buildup of greenhouse gases, the impacts are largely on temperature are largely delayed so far. The oceans have absorbed nearly all of that heat. The oceans are they store a lot of heat, and so it's not like people who expect clarity, who would only be convinced if there's some simple thing like the sun got brighter, suddenly, and the world's heating up. That'd be a simpler story to tell. But here you have that delay factor, so that it's a subtle change. It's still in the statistics. And you also have the reality that, as I said a minute ago, the losses so far in storms and floods and other climate-related extreme events are mostly still from increases in who's in the way, more houses, more people. So that makes it all statistical as well. And then you have actual uncertainty. One of the facts about global warming is that the calculations for how hot it's going to get from a doubled amount of CO2 are still between 1 and 4.5 degrees Celsius, more or less, somewhere in the middle range. And that uncertainty is real. It's a fact. We know that we don't know how hot it's going to get. And the same thing for sea level rise. When I was writing about this in that piece 31 years ago, the range of possible rise in seas in this century was pretty much what it is now. And this is because the great ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland are complex mechanisms. They also are slow to get moving, and it's not like an instant effect. And there's fundamental uncertainty there. And what uncertainty does is it creates a space where you can build your own argument based on either your personal interests, if that means, an oil company that wants to keep pumping oil, or if you have a political or cultural orientation that makes you more cautious and skeptical, or if you tend to get more worried about things. Some people react to uncertainty in different ways. So it's those factors, I think, create a landscape that allows that kind of paralyzed dynamic to persist. And again, this leads me back again to maybe we've been measuring the wrong things. You can argue a lot about climate change, meaning, as I just said, but it's much, much harder to argue about climate risk. Risk being defined by the hazard, hurricane, and how many people are in the way. That's called exposure. And vulnerability, which is, let's just say, poverty. So if you have poor people settling in floodplains, in an area famous for hurricanes, and there's 4 times more people there than there were 40 years ago. That's a crisis. It's a vulnerability. And there's things to do in policy and building codes and other ways to cut that risk right now. And so again, I think if I've been saying lately, maybe we would have been a little better off if we had an intergovernmental panel on climate risk, as opposed to an intergovernmental panel on climate change, because the risk has increased greatly in this last few decades in many, many places, including to heat exposure in the Middle East. There was a recent story of Qatar on the rising mortality in workers who have to spend a lot of time outside. And again, climate change is in the mix. It's going to make it even hotter, but the vulnerability is there implicitly. If you have more and more workers working in big buildings, think about the growth, just the increased urbanization in the Middle East in the last 40 years. People built that stuff, so there's more people in harm's way. And if they're not if they're not working with care for their exposure to heat and the like, you're going to have more heat-related mortality, that kind of thing. So there's tons to do. Breaking it into pieces makes it less contentious, and also acknowledging the uncertainty. There's actually an organization called the Society for Decision Making Under Deep Uncertainty. Their website is very simple. It's deepuncertainty.org. And they study this stuff all the time, not just in the context of climate change. We're always making decisions in the face of deep uncertainty. And I think one of the mistakes, perhaps, of the climate campaigning community has been to downplay some of that. Sorry, my dog's barking. So it's a part of the picture.
Great, thank you. That's a great response to talk about climate risk rather than necessarily climate change. We have a question here, sir, and then.
I lost the audio.
Sorry, we have a question.
No, I can't hear.
I can't hear the audio.
Can you hear now? Testing. Well, we'll circle back to. Okay. Okay. We'll perhaps ask you a question, and we'll type it in. We can hear.
I cannot hear.
Okay. We'll ask a question, and then we'll type in the.
Or just show him the card.
Well, we have maybe another question. Perhaps let's take we can, rather than a long, but if anyone has like some short questions that would like to put there together, and we'll sort out the technical issue.
I don't have any. Hello?
We'll call you online.
Just ask him a question and then he responds.
I think we have we connections on the phone now?
I hear you.
Good. Excellent, Mark. Thank you. I'd like to gather another question or reaction. Are you?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
No, that's a super, no, that's the point.
Still an enormous amount of flaring of gas at wellheads, including in North America and in Russia. So spreading that technology is essential, and it gets challenging when the wells are widely distributed. But there's ways to turn that gas into a product, even at the wellhead. On CO2, the main challenge of turning it into useful materials remains scale. It's we're emitting 40 billion tons a year now with a B, and the biggest operations around the world, I think, are about 1 million tons a year captured in some way or other, and there aren't a lot of products. Oh shit. The scale issue is enormous. There aren't a lot of things that we do at the 1 billion tons a year scale. So it's all important, and doing that work is essential. But it has to be in the context of the larger picture too. Ultimately, emissions reductions will be needed. Just one of the realities of this, the physics and the chemistry of CO2 as well.
Move on to the next remark.
Oh yeah, I'm Rusty Brainerd from the Red Sea Project. And I just wanted to follow up on some of your comments about vulnerability. You touched on several issues, and this is a little, maybe perhaps a little off topic, but the vulnerability side and the exposure side that you brought up, and you brought up the population in India and women's education, and all of those are all tied to climate, but we never talked about human population itself, and that's kind of the ultimate both consumer and user is that we're continuing to exponentially grow our population, and it's never discussed in any of the countries because of religious concerns. And how do we get that communication? Because that's really where the vulnerability of people is because we have more and more people in more and more vulnerable situations decade after decade, and those are exacerbated by more uses from climate change, creating more climate change, but exponentially increasing the vulnerability to hundreds of millions of people to that exposure that we talked about. Can you kind of bring up that communication side?
Oh yeah, I think by specifying
That high fertility rates produce big zones of vulnerability, you're spot on. And I think that's a story that's been missed because a lot of the environmental community reluctance to talk about population has been on the other side. There was this, in the 1960s, the main issue related to population growth was the idea that we'd consume the world, too many people. And having 9 billion or 10 billion people as opposed to 8 billion or 7.5 billion will lead to more consumption, but it's mostly the consumption rate of stuff we use and like energy we use that drives emissions. But as you say, what people miss there is that you're also increasing the number of people in harm's way. Nigeria is a case study in this. A lot of the scientists I talk to, and not just scientists, but policy folks, are really worried about Nigeria's fate. If we stay with the current fertility rates in rural Nigeria, you're talking about, even the number seems hard to believe, but it's a true thing that by 2070 or 2080, there'll be 700 million people just in Nigeria. Even more than that. That's the mid-range UN projection. And that's in a country with a lot of implicit climate variability, a lot of drought, a lot of other risks in this system there. The pressures on urbanization will be immense. So you think, well, it's been demonstrated that getting girls through high school in places like sub-Saharan Africa is a really nice path toward lower population, lower family size. Women have the freedom to, have control their fate a little bit more. That can lead to better outcomes. But Nigeria has all kinds of issues related to even getting girls through high school. So those, as you say, those issues are a really important part of the picture. And I've been writing about it a lot, but it doesn't seem to get into the broader conversation.
Or perhaps you go first and then
Continuation of the dialogue. It started out very early in the 1980s and 70s in the United States. There was a growing awareness on the risks, on the dangers of climate change. We in the kingdom just recently started this dialogue. It's just beginning. What would you suggest, and from your expertise, what would you suggest that we start doing? I mean, this is an example of a continuation of the dialogue that is our importance to the kingdom, to the people who live here. But could we start saying that maybe starting young, for example, I mean, talking about this issue and different issues with regard to climate change in relation to the kingdom and issues that we face here with young kids, for example, just beginning the dialogue in line with Vision 2030 and what we're trying to do.
I guess I would start with, I think there's a fantastic opportunity for leadership on the science, on the basic research. It's a country that has more experience extracting oil and moving large amounts of materials around than just about anybody. And it's a country that faces extreme environmental challenges through heat and drought routinely. So having a big boost in the scientific inquiry related to carbon dioxide management, related to energy efficiency, related to the next generation solar technology, and related to agriculture and water in regions that have insufficient capacity to manage to do more agriculture in a changing climate. That feels like a pretty great opportunity there. I'm not familiar enough with that strategy, the 2030 strategy, to know if R&D and the like is part of it. That would be a place where a country could sort of take the leadership position. Then just, climate vulnerability is another area, just managing heat. The hot, dry zone around the tropics appears to be expanding. So what can the Mediterranean learn from the Gulf countries would be something to figure out too. And all that's those are realities. Oops. Whether global warming ends up at the higher level or the lower level, those are fundamental priorities the world needs to work on regardless. I don't know if that makes sense.
just in the interests of being true to our schedule and saving some time for the second part of our seminar, which will focus on sort of a Chatham House rules discussion just here in the room. We might draw to a close our live stream and thank our online listeners. I'd ask you, Andrew, if you can stay online. You don't disengage
Yeah.
from us, because we can continue the discussion as a closed session now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if you haven't already unhooked, that Colombia is eager to be a partner on all all the kinds of enterprises we just discussed, including education. So we live in a world where no single entity is going to solve the climate problem or our sustainability challenges. So we're implicitly network building enterprise. And Colombia has stated right from the presidential level down a commitment to being a global force for the better outcomes on this.
So the conversation will continue online through Colombia in the future, but we'll just draw it to a close now. And so we're now offline.